Well, for the last talk in this workshop about knowledge in legal standard proof, Professor Timothy Williamson from the University of Oxford. The title of his talk is Evidence, Probabilities, and Externalism. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And before I get on to the topic of my talk, I should just say a word about this workshop, which I think has been extremely fruitful in the way that it's been getting philosophers and lawyers talking to each other, and philosophers of law and epistemologists talking to each other, and quite often events of this sort of interdisciplinary or inter-subdisciplinary nature involve a lot of tricky negotiation of incommensurable schemes and so on. But actually, it seems to me that we've been communicating pretty easily, and I think we should thank Diego and everybody else who's been involved in organising this event before we do anything else. So the topic I'm going to be talking about is not one that has been explicitly raised in the discussion so far, although I think it has bearings on some of the things that we've been talking about. So the central issue that I'm concerned with is the nature of evidence, but not so much as well what epistemic relation we've got to be into something for it to count as part of our evidence, but rather what the intrinsic nature of the something is to which we're related. In other words, or specifically, how evidence is individuated. The difference between, as we're encountering the same bit of evidence twice, or encountering two different bits of evidence, which arises, and it's not simply, as it were, a kind of philosopher's niche question. It's one that matters for assessments on the basis of evidence, because it determines whether we're talking about new evidence that we're encountering for the first time, or old evidence that we've previously encountered. And I mean, if you make mistakes about that, they can send your assessment of the evidence and of for example, the probability of a hypothesis on the evidence wrong, because if it's new evidence, then it's capable of raising or lowering the probability of a hypothesis. But if it's old evidence, then it shouldn't make any difference. If you imagine someone who keeps encountering the same bit of evidence over and over again, but they somehow think that each time it's a new bit of evidence. I mean, that, every time, let's say that supposing it favours a hypothesis, they might keep raising and raising the evidence of the hypothesis because they thought they were encountering more and more bits of evidence for the hypothesis, when actually they were just re-encountering the very same bit. So, you could go wrong quite seriously if you were confused about this matter. And what I'm going to be arguing for is a fairly coarse-grained individuation of evidence, on which, as it were, it's relatively easy to have the same evidence twice. against much more fine-grained evidence, individuation, on which where the more and more, much finer distinctions are drawn in the evidence. And another way of thinking about this issue is just what kind of notion of the content of the evidence do we have? Because presumably the assessment of the hypothesis on the evidence should be determined by the content of the evidence. So I'll say a few things just about the general framework in which I'm considering evidence before I get on to the specific questions of individuation. And one general assumption I'm going to make is that evidence should be propositional just in the sense that it has truth conditions. And the reason for that assumption is that, for example, we want to talk about hypotheses as being consistent or inconsistent with a given body of evidence. I mean, sometimes a hypothesis is simply ruled out because it's inconsistent with the evidence. And that notion of inconsistency is a broadly logical relation which can only hold between things that are, broadly speaking, propositional in the sense. I mean, you can't have just two rocks that are inconsistent with each other. They can be very different, but they're not inconsistent. So I'm not assuming that just because evidence is propositional, that it must be verbalized. I'm allowing that evidence can be perceptual in the sense that it's conveyed through perception, and that's because perception itself has some kind of propositional content, a truth conditional content, because when you have a perception, you have something like a distinction between veridicality conditions and the non-veridicality conditions, so that things can be as they appear to be in perception, or they can be some other way. And so that distinction already gives us some kind of distinction in truth conditions, and so that's enough for the content of perception to be propositional, even though it's not verbalized. I mean, you can't fully convey the content of perception in words. And I'm also assuming that genuine evidence has to be true, although this actually won't play such a big role in the discussion. And that's because if some claim is inconsistent with the evidence, then it's false. But if we have false evidence, that would be a non sequitur. So it's because the evidence has to be true that inconsistency with the evidence implies that the claim is itself false. I mean, my own view, which may surface a little bit, but it's not really what I'm wanting to focus on, is that the proper relation that's required for something to be part of your evidence is that you know it. So this is the equation E equals K, which I defend in knowledge and its limits, and of course that also entails the constraint that evidence has to be true because knowledge is factive. But I'm not going to focus on that. So we've got that evidence can be delivered in different formats, linguistic and sensory, maybe some other kinds of format as well. One thing that is important is that evidential relations can hold between evidence that comes in different formats. So, for example, suppose that let's say that somebody, maybe the accused or maybe a witness, appears in court and is seen by the judge and jury, and what they see of this person's physique may be relevant evidence to the claim that he was able to knock somebody down or whatever. I mean, depending on whether he looks strong enough to do it. Some claim might be just completely implausible once you've seen the person that it was about, or at least its probability is reduced. And so that's a case where what might be a verbal claim, some huge man who claims to have been kidnapped by a tiny woman or just by physical strength or something, that might be. Its probability would be reduced once you'd actually seen what they look like. So that's a claim in verbal form, being in this case disconfirmed by evidence in perceptual form. So that these evidential relations have to hold between evidence of different sorts of format, and it seems that it would be at least helpful in order to understand such, as it were, in a sense, these kind of cross-format evidential relations, if we had some sort of common currency or format-neutral framework in which to make sense of these relations. And actually, we do have a good candidate for that, which is the kind of mathematical structure that underlies probability theory, which, as it turns out, is also really pretty much in its most basic aspects the same as the mathematical structure that underlies what are known as Kripke frames for epistemic logic, those are the structures that we use in considering the logic of knowledge or belief. But I'm not going to go into issues of the epistemic logic, but just to say what the relevant aspects of this framework is. When you're serious about mathematics as about probability as a mathematical theory, and which, by the way, of course, is where probability theory actually gets its explanatory strength from, its mathematical structure. You could look up in a decent textbook what the underlying mathematical framework is, and it's based on the notion of a probability space. So just to say in bare bones what a probability space is, you start off with a set from a mathematical point of view. It doesn't really matter what the set is, but in fact it will be given informally and interpretation. This set is normally called omega in uppercase, whereas the corresponding set, if you're used to modal logic or epistemic logic, will be called W, but it's the same, basically occupying the same role. And from the point of view of the informal interpretation, in the probabilistic case, the members of the set are called outcomes. In the case of modal logic or epistemic logic, the members of the corresponding set are called possible worlds. And these are thought of as mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive, and as kind of, as it were, the most specific possibilities that we're going to be concerned with for the purposes of whatever application it is. And then we're also going to be concerned with subsets of this domain. In other words, in the probabilistic case, these are sets of outcomes which are known as events. And in the Kripke framework, these sets of possible worlds are known as propositions. And these are very important because these are exactly the things that probabilities will be assigned to. So that the probability space gives us an assignment of probabilities to events. And that kind of overall framework is a good fit for what I've been saying about truth conditions, because roughly speaking, the truth condition, if you have something with a truth condition, then it's going to determine a proposition, in other words, an event, which contains just the possible worlds or outcomes in which the truth condition obtains. And that's something that's not to do with the kind of format in which we're receiving the evidence, whether it's linguistic or sensory. It's something at some kind of underlying level. And of course, in the case of probability theory, there are various mathematical constraints on the assignment of probabilities to events. I mean, these probabilities have to be real numbers between 0 and 1, and for example, if you've got two disjoint subsets of omega, the probability of their union has to be the same as the sum of the probabilities of those disjoint sets, and so on. And those constraints are what give probability theory its explanatory power. And this framework, it also allows us to define various logical operations on propositions. So we can, because they're sets of outcomes come worlds, so if you intersect these sets, that's the same as forming the conjunction, because it gives you another set which consists of all the worlds where both the two conjoined sets are true, and you can do the disjunction by taking the union of the sets, and you can do the negation by taking the complement of the set within omega. All the worlds outcomes that don't belong to the original set. And so all these standard logical operations are defined on propositions, but you shouldn't think of that as showing anything about the intrinsic structuring of these propositions. It's not that they've got, as it were, quasi-syntactic structure corresponding to negation or conjunction or disjunction or anything like that, because after all, you can't divide sets into those which are intersections and those which are not, because every single set is an intersection of some sets, and so although you can apply these operations, the operation that you've applied to the sets is not encoded in the result. So these propositions that we're getting in that way, they're extremely coarse-grained because, for example, any two logically equivalent sentences will define the same proposition. So however, one might be very complicated and one might be very simple, and they might contain different atomic sentences and so on, but as long as they're logically equivalent, they will give us the same proposition. And so more generally, what we've got is that necessary equivalence is sufficient as well as necessary for identity. And that's by contemporary standards, that's a pretty coarse-grained theory of individuation for content. I mean, there are lots of kind of rather fashionable theories which individuate content in ways which are much more, as it were, contoured to the structure of the vehicles in which the proposition has been delivered, and typically what people have in mind are sentences rather than perceptual vehicles. But none of that is actually represented within the content of these propositions, and that is a strength of this framework. But I mean, partly because it hooks it up to mathematical probability theory, and partly because its neutrality makes it a suitable framework for discussing the interaction of, let's say, of linguistic or linguistically delivered evidence and non-linguistically delivered evidence. Right, so now I want to say something about, to go into a bit more specific detail below the level I've been talking about how these propositions are individuated. I mean, one thing that I haven't yet said anything much about is the nature of these worlds. I've said that they're mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, and for relevant purposes, maximally specific. But I haven't said more than that. And so, for example, I haven't said anything about whether the relevant kind of possibility is epistemic or metaphysical or something else. And so what I say will come round to that. But I just want to focus on a specific case which naturally arises for evidence, and that is the case of what are known as Frege puzzles, which are cases where you've got two singular terms that in fact refer to the same object, but in a non-obvious way. I mean, the classic example is Hesperus and Phosphorus, which are both refer to the planet Venus, the morning star and the evening star, but that they do so co-refer is something that might not be at all obvious to speakers. And I'll just, because it's kind of slightly easier to imagine it having some relevance to a legal case, I'll take the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from the Stevenson novella. And by the way, I mean, just to be clear, I'm assuming for the purposes of this talk that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they just are the very same person. That we're not talking about two personas in the same underlying body or anything like that. We're just talking about one person who's both the respectable Dr. Jekyll, a pillar of the establishment, and also the notorious evil monster, Mr. Hyde. Now, it seems it would be very natural to say that getting the evidence, let's say a witness says Dr. Jekyll walked past, and maybe another witness says Mr. Hyde walked past. I mean, so they're talking about the same person, in fact, but using these two different names whose co-reference may not be obvious to the jury or whatever. And so just on grounds of cognitive significance, which seems very relevant to evidence, I think the natural reaction to this is, well, clearly those are two distinct pieces of evidence and should be treated as such. And of course, Frege built his whole theory of sense and reference, inspired by examples like this, and and the Fregean view of what's going on is that these two names, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they have the same reference, they refer to the same person, but they have different senses, and the senses are something like modes of presentation of the reference, and so the same person is presented in one way, by that's associated with the name Dr. Jekyll, and in a quite different way that's associated with the name Mr. Hyde. And so the initial thought is that a Fregean framework is exactly what we need to make the distinctions that we are appropriate for the individuation of evidence. So that's when you can extend the Fregean theory of sense and reference to the level of propositions, where propositions will be something like Fregean senses of things that have a truth value, and then the reference is simply according to Frege, is just the truth value itself. So far that all seems fine, but I'm going to explain why things are actually nothing like as straightforward as all that suggests, and why there are competing pressures of a theoretical kind on us here that are quite hard to, as it were, to reconcile. So I'll mention two problems for the Fregean approach. The first of these is that you can essentially get Frege puzzles as long as you have two distinct words with the same reference. And you can get them even if those words are in fact synonymous. Right? Because people were thinking, it's like having two words with different meanings, but they refer to the same thing. But in fact, that's not the right one. I mean, you can't apply that to all these Frege cases. So I'll just give you one of the standard examples, which actually comes from, maybe people used it before, but it I think was introduced into the discussion by Kripke in a paper published in 1979 called The Puzzle About Belief, which I think is very revealing about these issues, although not quite in the way that Kripke intended. So here's a case. Just to take the two words, furs and gorse. These are synonymous terms, so not just co-referential. These are synonymous terms for the very same natural kind. It's kind of shrub, which I'm very familiar with because you get it all over the hills around Edinburgh where I grew up. There's no difference between these two words in meaning whatsoever. I mean, it's just, I suspect, and check the details more carefully, but probably these were just two words, in different dialects of English for the very same thing, and then, as all the different dialects of English got kind of glommed together. Somehow these two things survive. And there's, the native speakers don't associate them with different descriptions or different perceptual appearances in any systematic way. And now take somebody who understands both these words by the normal standards that apply to the understanding of natural kind terms, which, of course, that doesn't require, botanical, in this case, expertise, but just, some kind of rough ability to identify them or identify members, or not really even that is required. We can even take a speaker who has exactly the same associations between these words, and they don't associate them with different descriptions or different perceptual profiles or anything like that. But nevertheless, this speaker might be, quite rationally, just a little bit more confident of the identity furs equals furs than they are of the identity furs equals gorse, right? Because they might think, as far as I know, they're the same natural kind, but I could be wrong about that. I might be making a mistake. It's not very likely, but might be. And so just be a little bit less confident of when they're asked to whether they assent to furs equals gorse than they are to assent to the sentence furs equals furs. And as I say, without any subjective difference between them, except for the difference of word itself. And yet, as the case of furs equals gorse and furs equals furs go, they're different levels of confidence in them. That's enough to show in Fregean terms that the words differ in cognitive significance for them. And therefore, by the sort of official definition of Fregean sense, that they have different senses. But clearly in this case, the difference in sense is just a corollary of the difference in word. And so the whole level of Fregean sense, it's not really adding anything to the words themselves, because the Fregean senses are going to differ whenever the words differ. And so this level of Fregean sense is actually a kind of level of redundant middle management that that ought to be eliminated, because it's adding nothing to the theory that we don't already have just by being able to talk about the linguistic expressions themselves. So that, in a nutshell, is why the Fregean apparatus of sense and reference seems to be redundant. But also there's a second problem, which is that when we're concerned with evidence, we're concerned with the transmission of evidence, both over time and between speakers. I mean, we're concerned with preserving the evidence and also with communicating the evidence. And of course, when we're talking about, let's say, witnesses in a law case, the witnesses have preserved the evidence over time, and now they're communicating it to the jury or the judge or whatever. But when you think about what's going on in these cases, it's pretty clear that what we're interested in is the preservation of reference, not the preservation of sense in any kind of Fregean spirit. So there's a couple of examples of this on the handout. So for example, if you're, let's say you're watching some character NN and spying on them and seeing what they're doing, and you might you might learn by sight that NN is taking the money now or something, but you can't use that sentence to store the memory, because of course the word now will go out of date immediately, and so you've got to preserve it in something like, if you're going to preserve it in sentential form, it might be NN took the money at noon on 13th of November 2024. But obviously the sense, the mode of presentation associated with the word now is completely different from the sense or mode of presentation, in this case of a time, at by the phrase at noon on 13th of November 2024, and that's what Freudians themselves will say. So the key thing there is just preserving the reference to the right time. It's not preserving the sense. And and again, when you have a, let's say, just to simplify things, I've said a trusted witness who says, "I saw Mr. Hyde walk past." Maybe this is a member of the police in a society where the police are trusted. So obviously the jury won't use that very sentence to express the new evidence, because if they use that sentence, the I would refer to them and not to the police officer or the witness, whoever it was. So they might use the sentence, "The witness saw Mr. Hyde walk past." But even by any Freudian standards, the word I and the definite description, the witness, are associated with completely different senses, completely different modes of presentation. A first-personal mode of presentation versus a third-personal mode of presentation. So the focus is actually not on preservation of sense, as you might think, but on preservation of reference. Of course, we have to know that reference is being preserved, because if somehow reference was being preserved, but not in a way that we knew about, then there would be a problem. But I think that's actually explained by the need to have, well, I would say knowledge, but you could substitute some other epistemic relation for that, for present purposes. But I would say knowledge of co-reference in order to know the evidence, under the mode of under the linguistic guise that you're acquiring it in, and so it's not that the mode of presentation needs to be built into the content of the reference. Of the evidence. It's just that we do, in order to for the evidence as we acquire it to become part of our evidence, we do need to know that reference has been preserved. And in fact, another consideration, along the same lines, is that if we go back to the issue about old evidence versus new evidence. Supposing that you were gathering inductive inductive evidence for some hypothesis. So that, and you were observing instances. Let's say, evidence for the hypothesis that all swans are white or something like that. If you think about it, you don't really want many different observations of the same swan to count as different instances, because then you could, if you're just as it were accumulating positive instances of the generalization that all swans are white, of course, as we know, false generalization. But if if you keep seeing the same swan in different circumstances, and then you think that, oh, I'm acquiring lots and lots of instances of the universal generalization, all swans are white, something is going wrong. And it is way better to be observing a whole lot of different swans. And that is actually the coarse-grained individuation of evidence. So in some way, surprisingly enough, it might seem that it's actually the semantics of direct reference, where you think of the singular term as just contributing the object that it refers to the content, that it actually fits the social role of evidence much better than the more, in effect, individualistic Fregean conception. But of course, this isn't totally satisfying, because there's still this very strong sense. Well, look, but surely, somebody, that Dr. Jekyll walked past. Isn't that different evidence from that Mr. Hyde walked past? So I think actually one can explain why we're inclined to think of these as different evidence. It can be explained by our reliance on a certain kind of heuristic that we use in what's known as mind reading, i.e. the sort of psychological process by which we unreflectively attribute our mental states to others, much studied in contemporary psychology. One major form of mind reading, not the only form, but a major form, is using what one can call disquotational heuristics, which in fact are already hinted at in that 1979 Kripke paper that I mentioned. Although Kripke doesn't think of them as heuristics, he thinks of them as something like conceptual connections built into our concept of belief, but that render it incoherent. But I think, in fact, what he's talking about are heuristics, or the things that he's gesturing towards are heuristics. And heuristics here are something that psychologists have long been interested in, and that they describe as, in a positive mood, as fast and frugal ways of solving problems, and in a more negative mood as cheap and dirty ways of solving problems. So these are things that we rely on in cognition, and that are efficient enough to be useful, but are not by any means 100% correct. And some of these, many of these we use without any awareness that we're using them. So, for example, in perception, we automatically rely on a heuristic that's built into our visual system, where we use color boundaries in our visual field as a guide to the edges of three-dimensional objects in the environment. And I mean, you've been doing that all the time, but then you can become aware that you're doing something like that. For example, when you realize that camouflage in warfare is actually quite effective and really can deceive people about the edges of objects. And my general view is that a lot of philosophical paradoxes are in fact products of general cognitive heuristics that we rely on without realizing it, in the same way as visual illusions are products of heuristics built into our visual systems. And the relevant heuristics here are what are called disquotational heuristics, where, well, I've put the general kind of schema on the handout, but I missed out a crucial phrase. So it's, the idea is you attribute to agent S an attitude A to the proposition, the P, on the basis of S's interaction or lack of it, and it should say with quotes P, in other words, with the sentence P. And the relevant kind of interaction depends on A. So in Kripke's paper, he's talking about what I think is just a heuristic that we use, which is basically to attribute beliefs to people on the basis of what those people say. So, for example, if somebody utters the sentence, John, let's say, the quote's asleep, John is asleep, then we attribute to them the belief that John is asleep, and if they're not willing to utter or accept that sentence, then we attribute to them we say that they don't believe that John is asleep. And in the case of knowledge, which is the one more relevant to evidence, the kind of interaction is one which isn't just a matter of what people say, but of what, as roughly speaking, they're in a position to say. And the crucial point about these heuristics is that they're judging an attitude to a proposition by the subject's way of interacting with a sentence that expresses that proposition. But if you have cases where a subject interacts differently with two different sentences that express the same proposition, then the heuristic will give you inconsistent results in that case. And so these two sentences might, for example, be the sentence Dr. Jekyll walked past and the sentence Mr. Hyde walked past. And a speaker might assent to one of those and be in a cognitive position to assent to one without assenting to or being in a position to assent to the other. So that, as it were, we can explain the kind of illusion that we're dealing with different contents here by the fact that we're instinctively relying on a certain heuristic for the ascription of propositional attitudes. But that heuristic is not 100% reliable because it will give you these inconsistent results whenever you have cases of different sentences expressing the same proposition. And so, it may be that we're dealing with exactly the same content being presented by two different sentences, which are, of course, are cognitively different for the speaker, but the difference is all in the, roughly speaking, the linguistic form, not in the underlying semantic content. One way that people might respond to this problem is by saying, oh, well, in that case, shouldn't we be describing the evidence in metalinguistic terms? That the evidence is not that Dr. Jekyll walked past, but something like that the sentence Dr. Jekyll walked past expresses a truth, or something like that, to try to capture this difference. I don't think that going metalinguistic is going to help. It's partly because you can have Frege puzzles with metalinguistic sentences. I can talk about those in discussion if you want examples. So that it's not as though by going metalinguistic you get to a level where Frege puzzles can't arise. It's just that different Frege puzzles arise at the metalinguistic level. And it's also that there's something pointless about it because, the idea, this is now near the bottom of the second page of the handout. So the idea is to replace, as the content of the evidence the identity 1 that Dr. Jekyll equals Mr. Hyde by the identity 2 of the reference of the two singular terms. But the thing is, by any normal standard, we know that the referent of the name Dr. Jekyll is Dr. Jekyll, and that the referent of, quote, Mr. Hyde is Mr. Hyde. And so, given the things that we already know, that the 1 and 2 are equivalent. So it's not really going to make any difference. So I think that the way to go here is just to accept that if we want a decent notion of content, which is going to play well with, for example, the mathematical framework of probability and so on, that the appropriate notion of content is this very coarse-grained one, but that certainly will leave us with all sorts of things that we have to say about Frege puzzles, which won't magically go away on this approach. But I think that the way to handle it may be by, as it were, having both this underlying level of coarse-grained, format-free contents, but also a further layer on top of that, which is the layer of language in which we are discussing the underlying evidential and probabilistic relations, and where what we say will be what we say in the sense of the sentences that we utter will be very sensitive to matters of linguistic form, and with issues like the knowledge of co-reference and so on will figure, but this, as an upper level, we've got to understand how that works by looking at the linguistic form and not trying to as it were, project everything down into a level of content. And I think actually the same applies to the notion of proof in a non-legal context. For example, in mathematical proof, mathematical proof is concerned with form and not so much with content. And to some extent, when we're talking about, as it were, proof in the legal context, where the proof is discursive, but of course is referring to probabilistic relations and so on, that we have to see that as a further level on top of the coarser-grained stuff, which is where the probabilities are actually active beneath. And so I think that there's a connection there with what's been happening in a number of the talks, where we're talking both about evidential relations and about a secondary level in which we're concerned with what we know about these evidential relations, and I'm afraid that kind of messy cognitive structure is something that is going to be very, very difficult to get away with. So as I said to some people earlier, when they were asking, well, what's the conclusion going to be, and the answer is, it's complicated. So that's it.
Juan?
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting. So, one really, this is not a clarificatory question. So, and then a real question. So, this quotational heuristic for evidence.
Yeah.
So the idea is you're in a position whether you're in a cognitive position to assess P or not, we use that as a quick and dirty heuristic for whether P is part of your evidence. Is that what
The proposition P, yes,
But really, when you know that Dr. Jekyll would walk past, you thereby know that Mr. Hyde walked past, and they're both. I mean,
so
that one is part of your evidence. Okay. Yeah,
it's the same. It's the very same proposition that is expressed both times, and and I'm taking it that because you know it under one guise, you do know that proposition, right. but you can't, as it were, recognize. That it's the same proposition. Yeah.
So what happens when somebody thinks that Dr. Jekyll is not Mr. Hyde?
Yeah.
What is the content of their thought?
So here I'm going to in answering that I'll assume that the possible worlds that we're interested in are metaphysically possible worlds because I was basically arguing for keeping the epistemology out of the level of content, and so I'm also just assuming the standard view in logic that true identities are necessary, so that Dr. Jekyll is not Mr. Hyde. That is impossible, and therefore it's it's just the as it were the empty set of worlds, and so I mean this may sound shocking, but it's the same proposition as 2 + 2 = 5, and so and this of course this is something that we have to deal with all the time in mathematics, and that's so although the things like probabilistic relations actually have to be calculated at this level of content. There are lots of distinctions between sentences that are very important, which just don't appear at that level, and that's why we do need a level at which we are sensitive to those. But we just have to think of those as to do with differences of linguistic form or format in the case of perception, even though at the level of content it's the very same thing.
So the question was what is the content of their thought? So is the answer it's an empty thought?
I mean, it does express a proposition, but it's just the proposition is an impossible one.
I say okay, that's the proposition. Yeah. But then we can say a little bit more, which is that they assent to the proposition that Dr. Jekyll is not Mr. Hyde, and that is a non-trivial. I mean, that can happen or not. That happens.
Yes, it does happen a lot.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it happens in some possible worlds and not others, so we can.
Well,
so we can make distinctions there.
So yeah, so you can if you take the sentences describing people's interactions with sentences, then you can get differences. Those are different propositions. Yeah. I mean, a lot of them are different propositions, but I mean, I think. I mean, in the literature, this isn't usually appearing in. This is more in the literature on belief description and that sort of thing. But this kind of metalinguistic approach, has been used a lot by Stolnaker, for example, and he when he's talking about diagonal propositions, these are basically metalinguistic ones, and I think that at the one can't get rid of all the problems just by going to these metalinguistic propositions, because it turns out that in many cases you get corresponding inconsistencies at the metalinguistic level, and then as soon as you've got an inconsistency, you're talking about the empty proposition. So I think the only way to track them properly is by talking about the attitudes to propositions under the guise of certain sentences, or maybe under the guise of some perceptual presentation or something like that. And of which, of course, that's not the way that we normally talk. And but I think that because the way that we normally talk is not, we're not really aware of these issues. We're in fact kind of, it's often relatively easy to kind of gloss what we normally say in these terms where we're relativizing to guises, even though I don't think that's actually the correct semantics of the English or sentences of any natural language that we're using literally understood.
Do I have time for a quick follow-up, Diego?
Yeah. Well, we can wait for the follow-up.
Sure.
We have time anyway. So, Carlota?
Yeah. So I know that you've never been impressed by Freudian propositions, but you were a Brazilian. I remember you
Yes.
were a Brazilian, right? So the criticism that you launched to the Freudian approach will leave the Brazilian pretty much,
Yes.
unscathed. And the Brazilian will also have many of the benefits of the true conditional, like the coarse grain account, because you can have Boolean algebra as some set of Brazilian propositions, and people have done that. And so a lot of these kind of initial benefits wouldn't be lost to the Brazilian.
Yeah.
And like the Brazilian has a frege spazo, but it doesn't have, at least in a certain assumption, it doesn't have the Venetian logical problem. If you have a certain view of Platonic, I guess, mathematics and stuff.
Yeah.
So, my question is like, what made you take distance from that approach that seems consistent with what you're saying here?
Yeah.
Have a lot of the best benefits with it, or of course, and it gives a better view of the mathematical evidence if you are on certain assumptions about the knowledge of mathematics.
Yeah.
So
basically, I just came to the conclusion that Russellian propositions are more trouble than they're worth, and a couple of ways in which they're trouble is. One is, if the most natural theories of Russellian propositions turn out to be inconsistent because of the Russell-Myhill paradox, which is a kind of sort of variant of Russell's paradox, but for propositions rather than sets. You can avoid the Russell-Myhill paradox, but you have to introduce all sorts of messy restrictions in order to do that, and nothing like that. There are no problems like that for the intentional view of propositions that I'm now defending. But in relation to what we've been talking about here, one thing to observe, these Russellian propositions are usually understood as having a kind of quasi-syntactic structure. That they have a structure which sort of mirrors the structure of the sentences that express them. But that won't work for the contents of perception, which doesn't have anything like the structure of a sentence. And so if we're looking for a common currency in which we can talk about, probabilistically, for example, about both the content of sentences and the content of perceptions, Russellian propositions don't seem at all well designed for that. There's no.
Well, there are structured view propositions that are not in. Andrew Bacon has one account that is Russellian in the sense that you can always have endpoints or objects and properties, but they're not structured linguistically.
Yeah, but
and that overcome the kind of paradox we're talking about, and also it would be suitable for.
But the thing is, I don't think they're particularly well designed for the perceptual case. But also, you know, all these issues about Frege puzzles, we need some kind of apparatus just for tracking those cognitive distinctions, because the Russellian approach doesn't finesse those. And once we've got the cognitive, the kind of apparatus that we need in order to handle just the standard Frege puzzles, it will do. We can use the same apparatus to explain what's going on in all the other cases. And then, given that the kind of intentional view that I've been defending is massively simpler and more elegant than the Russellian approach, you know, that also seems like a fairly decisive argument for going, you know, for the intentional approach over the Russellian one, because although the Russellian one, you know, is a step towards the intentional one. I mean, basically, all the kind of things that you need to do to defend the intentional view. I mean, essentially, you're just using the same kind of moves that you're already having to do to defend the Russellian move view. You know, against Fregean objections. So that, you know, if once you pay the price of that kind of you know, apparatus of Geises or whatever it's going to be, you might as well draw the full benefits, which I think means going intentional rather than you know, going for this kind of rather unstable middle position that Russellianism represents.
Mauricio?
Thank you. Thank you. I am convinced, but I am wonder which are, if any, the consequences of our problems, of the evidence in the legal process and so on of this approach, because I don't know. It's if I saw, I don't know, Superman flying from the Empire State, I have evidence of this flying, sensorial evidence, but I have no evidence about the Clark Kent flying from the Empire State, and I don't know that's the situation of the jury, for instance, in a process. The jury saying that the evidence of the first proposition is the same of the evidence of the second proposition because it's the same proposition.
Yes.
It's the same proposition. It's, I don't know, I am not able to imagine that the consequences in this case is that the case is with limited knowledge, with this situation, I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, on my view, the jury does in fact have evidence that, you know, Clark can comply. It's just that they're not in a position to articulate that using the sentence Clark can fly. And that's why I said that we need another level of description, which is the sort of discursive one, where we're tracking, you know, what people are in a position to say. I mean, but you know, the more general problem, I think, is that, I mean, what we would love is to have a kind of level of description of our cognitive position that is completely transparent to us, in the sense that we're always in a position to know what our cognitive position is, you know, described in these terms. And for epistemological reasons, one can show that actually just cannot be such a a transparent level. And so we're always going to be in this kind of messy position where whatever rules, for example, that we give to judges about how they should handle evidence, there are going to be cases where they're not going to be in a position to know whether they're complying with those rules or not. And I think the crucial thing is not to let this kind of hopeless aspiration for transparency affect what we say about the judicial norms or anything like that, because I think, epistemologists have tied themselves into knots, in effect, trying to come up with epistemic norms that are transparent in this kind of sense, and it never works. But they do manage to make a very considerable mess of epistemology in the process of their search for El Dorado, and so it's partly just kind of warning about what the epistemic situation is. I mean, I can't pretend that that, as it were, having heard my paper, you'll be I've put you in a position where when you're in court you can just at some point intervene to stop right there. You're making a confusion between content and form or whatever it is. I mean, the fact is that human beings have evolved all sorts of ways of kind of muddling through with using this kind of apparatus that is in many ways opaque to us, and probably a lot of the time misdescribing exactly what's going on, but in sort of ways which we've managed to kind of insulate from terrible consequences, and so it's exactly I'm not suggesting that this is something that with the power to transform legal practice, and you might be very suspicious if I was making any such suggestion. But I think if we want to get a theoretical understanding of what is going on, where we are, I mean, it's natural that we would be concerned with content of the evidence as well as with matters of its form, and we have to realise what the kind of theoretical apparatus that we have at our disposal is, and and that includes issues about the what sort of apparatus talk of probability really needs in order to make sense. Because every time people are appealing to probability, if this is supposed to be probability in the mathematical sense, it needs a probability space of this kind. Otherwise, it's not properly defined.
Thank you. Federico Arena.
Thank you. But I just was trying to understand the way in which Freud cases and other puzzles can be solved using this your proposal, and just to better understand. Because all of these examples that poses problems to Freire are, I think, maybe I'm mistaken, but I think are cases of rigid references, so proper names or indexes. So what will happen when in the propositions there is the description?
Yeah.
So it will be the same to say the monster pass by and Dr. Jekyll pass by will be the same. The author of Alice in Wonderland pass by, the logic logic professor passed by will be the same proposition, or the...
No, so if you're, so I'm taking it that definite descriptions are not singular terms. That there's something more, more like quantifier phrases, and so they can be non-rigid, and then you won't get the same kind of substitution effects. I mean, that the substituting one definite description for another, even though they denote the same object, as it were, in our world, can easily lead to a difference of proposition. So, in those cases, what I'm saying about the names will not carry over. But the point is that those substitutions can lead to a difference in coarse-grained proposition. I mean, because they'll lead to a difference in which possible worlds the proposition expressed is true, and so those are the relatively unproblematic cases, where you. But those are not cases for which you need a specifically Fregean apparatus. They're ones that will just be handled by the kind of normal intentional semantics.
Selena?
Thank you. I have a twofold naive question as an outsider. The second part of the question is even more naive than the first. So to the question that you raised towards the end, if Dr. Jekyll walked past and Mr. Hyde walked past express the same evidence, why does it seem otherwise?
Yes.
I thought a very simple-minded answer that came to my mind is that there is some hypothesis for which they do provide different evidence. So provided the hypothesis that I want to test, or that is under consideration, is the hypothesis that the person who's both Hyde and Jekyll presents himself 50% of the times as one and 50% as the other. Then those two positions will present different evidence, so there will not be the same evidence. So my first question is, does that make sense? Is
Well,
that a plausible and relevant answer to the question at hand?
So, given the standard semantics which I'm appealing to here, if we're talking about the propositions that are expressed by those sentences, it just is the same proposition, and that's settled, simply by the compositional semantics. I mean, of course, if you're talking about the evidence that consists of, the fact that somebody uttered one sentence versus somebody uttered the other sentence, then those two propositions are they're not necessarily equivalent, and they express different propositions, and so they can have different evidential relations, and so that's a case where this particular problem goes away at the metalinguistic level if what we're concerned with is the evidence about somebody's linguistic behavior, as opposed to them simply as providing facts that we can rely on through the content of what they said. But and so you at the metalinguistic level you do get a difference in proposition there, even of course the grained propositions, but for the reasons that I gave, that isn't a kind of panacea. It's a move that is perfectly appropriate in certain cases, but it's not as though by going metalinguistic in general that one can get rid of all these problems. I mean, you'll get new Frege puzzles at the level of which sentence was uttered and so on.
Thank you. Edgar?
Thank you. Very related to these things towards which we lawyers tend to be more inclined to. I was wondering, in the case of so let me rephrase. How does this model accommodate issues of interpretation which are to the legal domain very important? For instance, let's just say that we have a sentence that incorporates an interpretation of a bodily movement, for instance.
Yes.
In one sentence, some witness says that I saw this person greeting me before I arrived, and the other I saw this person basically telling me to go away because she or he was warning me that some danger was in the house, and another sentence that tells us that person with the same movement was insulting the other person. So it's basically a different interpretation of the same bodily movement, which related to the last question. Yes. Basically, kind of it could be used to support different hypotheses.
Yes. So the three interpretation giving sentences that you gave, they're not necessarily equivalent to each other. I mean, there will be, for any two of them, there will be cases where one of them is true and the other is false. And so that means that those the interpretation giving sentences that you provided, they express non-equivalent propositions, which therefore will be just, even at the level of content, are different evidence. So although this is quite a widespread problem, it doesn't affect absolutely everything. But,
Thank you. Diego Papagiannis?
Thank you. It was a finger actually, but
oh, sorry.
That's why I did this.
Yeah, but that seems.
It's a big finger, maybe.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. That was my problem.
No, I was thinking in one example about the Superman. Think of a different example, because if I understood it correctly, you said that we have evidence, or the jury has evidence that Clark can fly or flew from the Empire State. But think John. We have evidence that John abandoned a child. That's all we know. As it happens, John is the child's father.
Yes.
He doesn't know it. There is evidence that a father abandoned his child. He has a special duty and it's a completely different thing. So in the legal context, these kind of examples seem like too much to say we have evidence that a father abandoned his child because it's necessarily his father. So
so the sentence John abandoned a child that's just an existential claim, right? There is a child such that John abandoned. There is a child X such that John abandoned
certainly
X.
A specific child.
Yeah, but I mean and of course John abandoned his son. I mean, his son is that's take it a definite description. I mean, of course, we say his son even in cases where the person may have several sons, but I mean, I think that's just because we're assuming some kind of contextually restricted domain. So I don't think there's anything in the semantics that even the coarse-grained semantics that I'm talking about that actually says that John abandoned a child and John abandoned his son would express the same proposition. I mean, I think I'm sure we could fiddle about with the case, and and talk about that child and John as the name of his son or something, and so we could get a case in which we were dealing with sentences that did express the same proposition, and then we would, as it were, if we were going to do everything correctly, as opposed to just kind of muddling through with the usual kind of confusions, we would have to talk about John's the evidence for a given proposition under a certain linguistic guise and so on. But one thing to say about these is that already these kind of distinctions are just implicit in the general probabilistic framework, simply because of computational issues. So if you take just a given sentence and something which is in fact tautologically equivalent to it, but is of enormous logical complexity. I mean, it seems like a natural description of some case might be that we know this but we don't know that, but that is just a thing that is in fact tautologically equivalent. But if you try to apply probabilistic apparatus to that, you'll not be able to distinguish the probabilities because it's built into probability theory that tautological equivalents have the same probability, and so that in a way we're already dealing with these implicitly with these kind of things. I mean, they may not occur, they may not crop up so much, but
no, but it's much simpler. I think that in a courtroom, to prove that John abandoned Peter is one thing, and to prove that John abandoned his son requires much more evidence.
Yes.
A DNA proof, for example. So it can be the same proposition.
But
to prove the first, you need less evidence than to prove the second.
Yeah, but
even if there is a metaphysical connection between Peter and John's son.
Yeah, but the thing is that those are not going to be necessarily equivalent according to the intentional semantics, because one of them entails that John has a son that he abandoned, and John has a son, and the other doesn't entail that. So it certainly doesn't entail that he abandoned those. So that I don't think in fact that is an example that fits the sort of problem template that we're talking about. It's not really a Frege case by the standards of the semantics in question.
Jaime?
Thank you, Professor. My question maybe is
Go on, sorry.
maybe it's an historical one. So, what was the main problems about the Carnap inductive logic that produced the election of this theory of probability and the Kripke frame to address epistemological things? So the formal framework about these problems.
Yeah. So the kind of theory of probability that we're talking about, I think, emerged independently of anything that Carnap was doing and earlier. So Carnap, his stuff on inductive logic, that was a kind of a project that was specific to a certain kind of interpretation of probability and so on. The stuff that was the basic mathematical framework for studying probability was developed by Kolmogorov, the Russian mathematician, and as far as I know, completely independently of Carnap, and and just in a fairly standard mathematical style. I mean, with because you have these spaces with a basic domain and then structure built up on that. You have that all over the place in mathematics. I mean, you talk about topological structures and spaces and so on. And so I don't think that Carnap's failures with inductive logic really had anything to do with it. And I don't think mathematicians would be, even if Carnap's project had worked out better than it actually did, I don't think mathematicians would have been that interested because Carnap's approach, doesn't give you a very general account of probability. It gives you some kind of special type of probability that's supposed to be built into the structure of a language, and the mathematicians are not thinking of probability as language dependent. So they might have, if it had gone better, they might have said, okay, well that's something. Carnap's come up with a particular class of probability spaces that for some reason interest philosophers. I think that would have been their attitude. So and this thinking in terms of kind of spaces that mathematically with some kind of structure built on top of them. I mean that's something that in physics goes back to the 19th century, and and of course there are also thinking a bit more algebraically, it has also roots in 19th century mathematics. And actually, if you're interested, Kripke once told me that his use of possible worlds was actually to some extent inspired by the kind of phase spaces that you get in physics, and it was a kind of generalization of that. And in fact, the way Kripke does it, which is much closer to what you would get in physics than to anything that Carnap was doing, I mean that's actually the crucial generalization, because the trouble with Carnap's approach was that he didn't have a proper distinction between models and worlds, and because Kripke's key innovation was not the only one, but an important one, was to build a set of worlds into each model and let those vary independently, and that's the kind of thinking about spaces that you get in mathematics and physics and so on. But it's not what Carnap was doing.
Juan Comesaña, second round.
So you say, I think I get it where you go when you say that Frege Pascals can arise for even when you go metalinguistic.
Yes.
But what I was wondering is, can they arise for Geises as well? So would that...
Yeah. So I think that the thing about Geises is I don't think that Geises are something that one should make too much effort to theorize, because what Geises are for is for kind of adapting the underlying structure to some kind of epistemic level, and really what we want are the Geises just to capture the cognitive differences that are important in a given setting. And so in an awful lot of cases, particularly in philosophy, the Geises just need to be sentences. I mean, sentences will do the work. But it's certainly not the case that just using sentences will always work because, in cases of perception, when you have something like, the sentence, this is a murderer or whatever. I mean, that could express different. It's not just a sentence. It's also the kind of perceptual presentation that's associated with the demonstrative this, and with a bit of ingenuity, you'll probably be able to think of cases where even that level of fine grained in the guise isn't enough, and you need to add something more. And so I think what we've got is this kind of theoretical framework that we have in probability theory, and then and in epistemic logic, and then we have to, in order to understand with a lot of cases, we somehow have to find some way of talking about the kind of epistemic friction that it makes the real case messier than this kind of nicely working, theoretically understood case. And then so I think it's kind of like some stuff that we have to put in to explain why what the difference is between a given theoretical model and reality with all its complications. And and I don't think there's any one way of doing that. So that, for example, it's not. I don't think it's so different from, let's say, from a case where on the one hand you have a theoretical model of the solar system where you treat planets as point masses, and then of course you have to explain why planets are not really point masses, and probably this model will actually be very slightly inaccurate because the ways in which planets differ from point masses in some contexts are extremely important, especially if you have to live on one. And so as it were, whatever level we go to, it's going to have a potential for things like Frege puzzles and other ways in which it's just not transparent to us what the situation is at this level, and and then we just have to kind of handle that. I mean, it sounds bad, but in a kind of ad hoc way, because there will always be this difference between a nice theoretical framework and messy reality, and there's no kind of canonical language for describing mess.
Edgar?
No, just a very simple clarification question. Could there be kind of a quote, these quotational heuristics for the case of sensory experience or perceptual experience?
Well, so the different, so these disquotational heuristics, these are heuristics for kind of describing things in words, and so they can take a particularly simple form, when we're using linguistic behavior, as the input, because we can. Basically, what we're doing is we're taking over the sentences uttered by the person that we're describing, and then kind of reusing them with certain. I mean, we have to fiddle with pronouns and tenses and so on, but as far as possible, we're just sticking to their words. I mean, I think. Obviously there will be some kind of perceptual equivalence of that. I mean, they're not very exact, but because we do have ways of, for example, when you take a photograph, I mean, so you see a beautiful sunset and you want to be able to communicate it to others, and so you can take a picture of it and send this as to your friends or whatever, and so you're in the same way you're staying in the same format, but kind of adapting it to communication, but except it's just that it's a visual format rather than a linguistic one. I mean, that's just would be a kind of rough analogy. I mean, one thing I was going to say is that, of course, these are not the only heuristics that we have for attributing mental states, because I mean it's pretty clear, because we can attribute mental states to non-human animals and to young children who don't have language, and we can also attribute them to people whose language we don't understand, or to people that we're not in linguistic communication with for other reasons. And so there are all sorts of behavioral heuristics that we can use, and some of those will probably have their own Frege puzzles, but of a somewhat different flavour.
Carlotta?
Yeah, so let me ask you more explicitly about logical omissions. I wasn't quite sure what you would.
Yeah.
So Stonecker doesn't go metalinguistics for the logical omission, at least there isn't, right? And so what he uses fragmentation. The fragmentation strategy.
Yes.
So one reason I think it does that is that so the logical omission problem is that if you're not P, then everything that follows from P you should know as well, right? So that's it's weird. And why not go linguistic there? Well, because it's not even clear that you need to have in your language a sentence with a specific position that follows from P, right?
Yeah.
So you may not even have it,
Yes.
right? So the metalinguist is not clear that they will capture. You'll have enough power, so you don't need to have every sentence that is interior.
Yes.
And so, so fragmentation is one way in which course creating people. Is that the way you're thinking you're going? Because or you think that you can involve guises or something?
I think you need guises, because I think you can have people can in some sense believe contradictions, or you judge contradictions without having any fragmentation. And I mean the trouble with Stolnaker's approach is that he's treating cases where people assent to for example, something, a mathematical sentence which actually expresses something that's mathematically inconsistent. He treats those as cases where they don't actually kind of have proper understanding of the sentence. But I mean, it's not just that that's an extremely implausible description of what's going on when, let's say when Frege assents to some, principle that is in fact inconsistent, that, he doesn't understand what he's assenting to. But also that, I mean, there doesn't seem to be, any kind of fragmentation going on, and in these cases, it seems like without any sort of fragmentation, somebody is, both. They're assenting both to this implicitly inconsistent sentence and to they're assenting to all the basic semantic principles which are needed to interpret it, and so and they're doing that in not separately but together, and so that if you formulate the claim that such and such a sentence is true, and then you can join it with the other semantic stuff that the subject knows and is using to interpret it, which they're doing in, as it were, in a single conscious state, you'll actually get a further inconsistency, and because the semantic stuff will, when combined with this metalinguistic belief that the sentence expresses the truth, will actually give you, a more complicated inconsistency, because the sentence can't express the truth given what its semantics are, and so that the metalinguistic approach doesn't really seem to capture what's going on.
The metalinguistic approach won't.
Sorry?
The metalinguistic approach won't capture.
Yeah, it won't capture because it's just subject to. Whereas I think if you just do it in a more straightforward way and say, look, they're in effect assenting to the impossible proposition under the guise of the following sentence, that seems like a pretty faithful description of what the person is actually doing, which isn't attributing anything very weird to them, and it's just that there are going to be lots of situations in which we can't track what's going on cognitively, without just being serious about attending to exactly which sentences people are using. And I think a kind of case which doesn't involve logical omniscience, where you need that, is actually in the semantics of mathematical proofs, because the only way to understand a mathematical proof is by actually talking about which sentences are involved, because it's the sentences themselves that determine whether let's say modus ponens is being applied, or some logical rule, and actually it's in a way it's even worse than that, because in a standard mathematical proof you have lots of for example equations with variables in them, and because they have variables in them and they don't have quantifiers, these are free variables, and therefore by normal semantic standards they don't express propositions at all, and it's just something like you'll get x squared is greater than y, or something like that, and there's no well, that's an inequality, but the inequality x squared is greater than y, that doesn't express any proposition, because no particular values have been assigned to x and y, and so you can't really track what's going on in mathematical proof at the level of content at all. I mean, it's not, people sometimes talk as though you have to get to the real proof, you have to abstract away from the linguistic forms, but actually when you've done that, there's no proof left. I mean, that's why proofs, in mathematics are kind of implicitly formal, and so this. As soon as you think about mathematical proof, you realize that that most of the cognitive action there is at the level of linguistic form, not at the level of content. And I think, although it's not quite as extreme as that in, let's say, legal discourse, actually, you have to be prepared to do quite a bit at the level of linguistic form.
Okay, I have a question. One last maybe. So I was thinking about the relation between evidence and epistemic reasons, because according to your answer to this question, is my second one. I don't know how you conceive the relation between your evidence and your epistemic reasons. Maybe all your evidence is epistemic reason, and only your evidence are your epistemic reasons.
Yeah.
And if this is so, I was wondering about one possible consequence of your account about the Frege problem, Frege problems or cases, related with the practice of justification in the way we understand, usually in the legal context, the practice of giving reasons in a judicial decision, for example, in order to justify the acceptance of a factual premise. So, according to your account about Frege cases, if I understood, could be the case that you have evidence I have evidence about a proposition P,
Yes.
for example, that Dr. Jekyll walked past, that I cannot use in order to justify justification in this particular sense. I cannot use that as a reason to justify a conclusion, for example, that Mr. Hyde passed.
Yeah.
And I know that Mr. Hyde passed because I have that proposition in my knowledge,
Yes.
is my evidence, but it's not an epistemic reason that I can use.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit strange for me.
Yeah. Well, so I take it that reasons are facts, and that facts are true propositions, and the ones that you have are the ones that you know. That's what it takes to have a reason. And so all these issues will come up for reasons in the same sort of way, and that's so that's just another manifestation of the fact that these none of these epistemic phenomena are totally transparent to us, so that it can be that one thing, that you have some reasons for doing something, but you're not in a position to know that there are reasons for doing it, and but that's given that there is no level of mental life that is transparent to us. I mean, I think you just have to accept that. I mean, reasons don't have any magic power for, inducing transparency that these other epistemic relations and states lack or something. I mean, they're just subject to the same limitations as everything else.
Okay, I can accept it perfectly. But so this is a consequence. I could have evidence of some fact that I cannot use as a reason in an argument. For example, I know that Mr. Jekyll walked past, Dr. Jekyll walked past. I know that, and also I know that Mr. Hyde walked past, but I don't know that I know that Mr. Hyde walked past. So,
well, I mean, I don't think it's not going to work that way, because whether you know that you know is that will be just as a context in which substitution works just as much as any other. The thing is, you've got all these nice connections at the level of content, but you're not in a position to articulate them by certain kinds of sentences which do in fact express them, and so so that your act is being hampered by all these limitations in how we can hook up what's going on at the level of content with these propositions, and what's going on at the level of linguistic form in which we might want to express something about that, and because those connections are opaque to us, we can't use them. Use given sentences to express things in a knowledgeable way, because we don't have the right connections built in, and that's life.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, to the contributors, Juan and Carlota and Federico and Edgar and Timothy, for these six wonderful presentations. conditions, and a very interesting, I think so, debate. Oh, I said, and I am very happy to participate in that. I think that was possible at this moment to experience the possibility to make certain bridges between epistemology and these bridges, but between epistemology from a philosophical point of view and evidence, legal evidence from jurisprudence and legal doctrine point of view. And thank you very much. I think so that it's possible to repeat that in a future. Thank you.